you as well. So it'll get sent to you. So if you want to forward it to somebody who you feel could potentially benefit, that's also a possibility. All right. So as I've already mentioned now a handful of times, if you've been on the call for a few minutes, that this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. And I feel like I tend to get the patients or clients that are either struggling with fertility or who have just gotten pregnant or who want to have a successful pregnancy. So these have been going fairly long. So it's my intention this evening to make it under 45 minutes. So we are going to talk about how do we foster and create the next generation of healthy kids, and how do we do that successfully? So most of you have been on this call. I see a lot of familiar faces on here. If you haven't, my name is Dr. Colby. Me and my business partner, Alex, have started Haven Holistic Health. It's 100% virtual health practice. We had an office in Chicago. And what we really try to do is empower and educate all of our patients to recognize your own self-healing potential. So when you aren't getting the results that you want with your health, when you're not sure about what to do next, we're experts at uncovering what the problem is and allowing our patients to know what action steps to take through education and empowerment so that they can be empowered to take the next steps with their health. So what we're going to hammer home tonight, again, the goal of this talk and this conversation is to really set the stage and to give us some perspective about what holistic medicine even is. If you've seen me speak before, this will be a quick 10-minute, hopefully faster review and cover up about what we've talked about before. We'll talk about the current stats. We'll talk about why potentially some of these things are the way they are. Talk about what to do about it, both through nutrition and through toxins. So the goal of this is that you can step away with action steps. Like, to me, I'm a very action-oriented person. So understanding things from an intellectual perspective is important to me, but it's not as important to actually know and understand what to do next. And so if you have any questions and you're like, hey, I'm curious about this, just post in the chat or just ask quickly. And because it's such a small crew tonight, you guys can, if you have anything and you're open to share about it and you're wanting direct support or you're confused about something or you've read a blog about something, like, just feel free to ask away and I'll be able to help answer any questions. So let's just quickly recap this because this has been going before the beginning of the year. We've talked about this a lot. So if you haven't seen on our YouTube, on our Instagram, we have a full hour-long presentation that talks about all of this. It's called our patient orientation, to orient ourselves towards what holistic medicine even is, because all of our patients, all of our clients, they don't even know what it is. And it's nobody's fault, but it's the system that we've been inundated with from when we were born, right? So from a holistic perspective, we believe that the body is an intelligent living entity. So it's not a machine, right? It's not some mechanical machine, because what separates a table from a dog, right? It's this intelligent living entity that we all have. And we believe that symptoms are messengers of a deeper imbalance or problem. So instead of trying to suppress symptoms, what we do is we help uncover why the body would be communicating in that way. We believe that health is your natural state, so that we have been born on this planet to thrive, not just survive. So if we're just surviving, it means that there's a natural imbalance that we haven't addressed. And when someone's experiencing a disease or specific symptoms that are associated with a diagnostic ICD-10 code. That's an intelligent response of the body to a violation of nature's laws. And so what we do is it's intellectually fairly straightforward to understand, right? It's not rocket science, because in my belief pattern, what I've experienced just personally in my own life is that things that are true. Sorry, we got a comment here. Let me just pull this up so I can communicate here. Is that things that are true in my own life experience, my spiritual practice, my belief pattern of becoming mindful, things that are true resonate from a lens that's not complex to understand, right? And this is what our challenge is how do we take the complex entity of the body, of everything that we're experiencing, and we make it practical and easy to understand. And when we do this, we follow nature's laws. So we have Lauren here, and she's talking about that through toxins. Yep. So she's asking specifically about the different spike protein response that are specific to the COVID vaccines and what to do about it, or what do we recommend for infertility for individuals that have taken these vaccines or these shots. And that's a really good question. We'll talk about that more in depth. So let's get through these first just intro slides, and we'll talk about all of that, because our first 4 topics are all going to be over toxins, and I have one that's just other. So we'll talk about that more in depth, because that is a really good response. I mean, if we look at the infertility rates the past 2 years, they've skyrocketed. Same with cardiac problems in men, right? So there's spike protein that is the response of specific COVID vaccines are responding to specific tissue within the body. Yeah, and it makes sense that's how it works. That's how health works. And so it's just understanding why, but what to do about it. So we'll talk about that. And that's the whole concept of this. So quickly, if you haven't heard of this guy, he's the one that basically brought our medicine to the States. So he had his own problems. He got healed over in Germany, and he brought the principles and the foundational understanding of naturopathic medicine to the US and allowed it to spread. Okay. In the early 1900s, there were more naturopaths and homeopaths and osteopaths than there were MDs in the entire country at an exponential pace, right? And not until the Flexner report, which if you want to do some historical understanding, you can research that. Not until that came out, and I believe 1910, did the perspective of medicine start to change. And so the whole concept of this is that this is still the medicine that we practice. So when you aren't getting the results that you want, let's say fertility, instead of trying to do specific protocols at first or fill in the blank what you're trying to do, we always recommend going back to the foundational principles and pillars. Is your body too toxic, and can your body deal with its own metabolic waste? Like, huge pillar that nobody actually talks about, or understands. Pillar 2, nutrition. Are we eating proper diet that's specific to us, where our ancestors are from, both with foods that we're cutting out and foods that we've incorporated? And are we doing all of the principles or nature's laws that we've evolved to do for thousands of years? Drinking clean water, touching the earth, staying away from artificial light, and the list goes on and on, so that our body's innate self-healing mechanisms can improve. And so this is, again, where we try to speak common sense, because we want all of our patients to be empowered and educated, that if you don't know where to start about anything in your life, you're confused with your health, you start with these 3 pillars. So this is a great illustration that we always talk about, is that evil is not an accident nor an arbitrary punishment, right? It's not always an error of the mortal mind. It's the natural and inevitable result of the violation of nature's laws. Most importantly, it's instructive and corrective in purpose, and will remain with us as long as we need its salutary lessons. So this is whatever you want to throw up here: a cough, weight gain, infertility, cancer, constipation, appendicitis. And so we know that if we don't use the 3 pillars that I just mentioned, then the soil of the tree and the roots of the tree can't actually take hold. And when that happens, we experience problems and disease. And so, again, we have an hour presentation that talks about all this extremely in depth. We talk more about the history, talk about how we got involved in terms of our own personal story. So I don't want to zoom past this, but I do want to be very aware of our time frame here. And so just want to prep us for where we're trying to go, because even if we're experiencing toxins in the world that we can't control, like some individuals having to being forced in to get the COVID vaccine, and now they're having troubles with fertility, then there's things that we can do about it because we follow nature's laws and we don't violate them, and we use the 3 pillars of healing. So it's always where we want to take you so that you have a framework, a perspective to start to think about everything we'll talk about. So here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the current stats. We're going to talk about 4 major toxins. Then we're going to talk about nutrition and those principles. And then we are going to move on and talk about one case study that I just had. We'll talk about that in depth, and then we'll answer any questions. Okay. So what are the current stats? It's going to sound a little depressing, and it was a little depressing, honestly, researching some of this. Obviously, I'm familiar with the majority of this, but there were some really interesting stats that I thought were important for us to pull up. So obviously, I understand that the topic of the conversation is fertility, but I also want to talk about is that even if women are able to have full-term pregnancies, the chronic disease epidemic in children, including developmental problems, are astronomical. So I'm not even including those in the stats of women carrying to full term, which is why I think this topic is probably the most important topic. Because if we don't get this under control in terms of chronic disease in children, we talk about the debt ceiling trying to be raised and all of the other topics that we're really communicating about now in terms of the economic capacity that's happening within our country. Well, it's not even going to be comparable because our health care is going to cost so much. And this is why we're so adamant about this, is that health starts with the mom and dad, bottom line. So if they aren't doing everything they possibly can to have a healthy and happy pregnancy, and then especially while you're pregnant, and then the first at least 2, if not 4 years of the child's life, then there's going to be issues. And we see this consistently within the statistics. So you guys can read this, but on average, about 1 in 5 women, and I believe this was 2019 or 2020, so it's not even current today, are unable to get pregnant after 1 year of trying, and 1 in 4 have difficulty getting pregnant or carrying a pregnancy to full term. So we see, let's say 20 to 25% are having trouble in the beginning just getting pregnant, which is it's a huge stat. And the sperm quality and concentration is exponentially, I'm talking at an exponential pace, declining about almost 1% a year, depending on the stats that you use. And here's some even more crazy statistics, is that from 73 to 2018, a drop of 51.6% of sperm concentration, which is unbelievable in my opinion. And what's even more crazy is that the sperm concentrations declined by almost 1% a year, but the data is actually getting worse and not better. So both the sperm quality and the sperm concentration are declining at a rapid pace. So I feel like oftentimes in this topic, we just talk about women and their path and their hormone history and what that means and that whole downstream effect. But I want to just keep in mind that this topic of conversation is meant to be for men as well, because the quality of the sperm and the concentration of the sperm is 50% of the process for the actual fertilization process to take place. So if we aren't talking about this, we're missing half the story. right? And so what's even crazier is that the mortality rates in our country are the worst by far compared to any industrialized country in the entire world. So the mini stats say that if you have for a mom, so this is again maternal mortality. So this is the mom passing away during birth or the birthing process. I believe it's 24, maybe 36 days prior to birth. That a mom in our country has a higher chance of dying in the birthing process than most non-industrialized countries, including that of Cuba, including that of many Latin and South American countries as well. So not only are we having trouble getting pregnant, there's a disproportionate amount of mothers who are passing away or dying in the pregnancy process. And then once and if the pregnancy process takes place, the epidemic, as we've already talked about, of chronic illness in our country is it's crazy. It is an unbelievable stat of all of this was again in 2001. So you have to think about in a decade, things are getting much worse. So we see here in terms of asthma, 1 in 8, allergic eczema, 1 in 5, hay fever, 2 of 5, food allergies, 1 in 12, obesity, 1 in 5, which that's much higher now, celiac, 1 in 8. We have autism, which now these are astronomically higher, 1 in 30, 1 in 36, and the list goes on and on and on. So a multitude of chronic illness in children on top of the developmental disorders and autism drastically rising and increasing, with stats that are getting worse and not better. And so I know these are pretty dreary stats, and I'm not trying to really take your beginning of summer and not make it exciting here, but it's something that we have to talk about in a very important way because of what's happening within our country, and the continued trend will literally bankrupt our country in ways that we can't even understand. And so this is why I think for everyone on this call who's thinking about getting pregnant, it's a process. And in many traditional tribes, the process to get pregnant was a 3 to 4 year process. And they oftentimes mention and discuss that the process in terms of having and spacing out kids, if the kids weren't spaced out by 3 years, they knew there were going to be problems, which I think that's a little bit extreme in terms of the context of what we're talking about here. I think this is a multitude of factors. But if we're thinking about having kids, if it's even on our radar the next year, I think the minimum is about 6 months we have to prepare. And this is meaning that it's the number one priority in your life is getting your body nutritionally prepared. It's getting yourself emotionally and spiritually prepared. It's making sure that your body's not toxic, which is passing those toxins to the fetus, which is what we're going to talk about next. So we always recommend to all of our patients the fertility awareness practice, which is actually different than the rhythm awareness practice, which is something that the rhythm awareness is what many of the apps use, which is like Flow. And I think all of those is part of the process. But the fertility awareness practice was actually made really popular by the Catholic Church, which is interesting. And in terms of if it's taught correctly, it has a higher success rate. I should say if it's taught and it's utilized correctly, it has a higher success rate than birth control, which is, again, another just wild stat that's out there. And so in all transparency, I'm not an expert in this. So there's many resources, especially for the females on this call, that you can literally just search fertility awareness, and I have a whole resource slide at the end to track these 3 things. So it's a 2-minute process that you first take your temperature upon waking. If your temperature is cooler, that's happening usually before ovulation. And then right when you start to ovulate, your metabolic capacity increases. So on average, we see an increase about 0.8 to 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit during ovulation and then to the actual first bleed. And that's usually what we're talking about in terms of the waking temperature. This is what many of the apps track, which is a really good tool. But the other aspect that I think most women don't track would be cervical fluid and the actual cervix changes, because these 2 things are communicating, right? Because all in all, your cycle is just like the earth, right? The earth has seasons of change, which are all impacted by what? They're impacted by the temperature and by the dryness or by the rainfall, depending on where you're at on the globe. And so the same thing's happening to the female body over the course of 28 days, both with the cervical fluid and the cervix, which is preparing the body for ovulation, that if fertilization happens, then everything is in place for that to go smoothly. And that's the 28-day cycle on average, if you want to summarize it in a very simplified way. And so understanding your cervical fluid and understanding the changes in your cervix are extremely important. And this process, with a little bit of education, isn't hard to understand. It can provide an opportunity for you to be in the driver's seat. And so that is what we always try to advocate for, because I think part of the process has been that since the 1960s, synthetic estrogen has been pumped into our population. And there's political reasons that we don't have to talk about. There's tax reasons we don't have to talk about. But just, again, a little bit of research online, you can see what has transpired in terms of women going into the workplace, which, like anything, is great. It has pros and cons to any aspect of making a decision that changes the culture. And part of that pro is that women have opportunities now that they've never had before. Part of the con is that most women in their timeline have taken synthetic estrogen, and they haven't actually been taught, how do we look at our body's communication with what nature has always done, so that we can be in the driver's seat and understand when we can get pregnant, really get to be familiar with our hormonal cycle. And so instead of me talking about this in depth, I want you guys just to do a quick search online if you're interested. It's definitely where I would start with all of this. They have great resources. You can even find a specific practitioner if you're interested that can educate you about the entire process. But in my opinion, in terms of really understanding where things are at for fertility, especially for females, a great place to start. Sorry about that. Hang on 1 second. So we're going to talk about 4 toxins in particular that we haven't talked about that much yet. So the first toxin that I want to talk about one second here, sorry. Hang on, little technical difficulties. I got home late last night from my holiday weekend, so I am a little tired myself. So I apologize for that. Here we go. So we just talked about this. So the first place, again, where we're going to start with anybody that we're trying to say, hey, you need support trying to get pregnant. Okay. The first thing we're going to do is say, okay, what pillar do we have to support the most in what consistent fashion, right? Number 1, detoxification. Number 2, nutrition. Number 3, lifestyle, or are we living in alignment with nature? Okay. Those are the three pillars. For most people who are having fertility or pregnancy, I'm going to say issues or problems, usually that's stemming from the toxic soup of the world, right? So this is a really interesting estimation that I read, and this publication was published in 2020, describing that there's over 350,000 chemicals that we can be exposed to, and that number is counting effectively. So obviously, chemicals are extremely important. That's how we have a home. That's how we have a car, right? There's many things that are benefits to that process, but the downfall is the pollution, both internally and externally, that we're experiencing today. And so I think we know the majority of this, but there's 4 interesting ones I wanted to chat about, because I think these are 4 action steps that you could start taking today to allow your body to become less toxic. And number 1 is polyester. So polyester it's unbelievable how when you start to become aware of the clothing that you use, so this would be almost all of the Lulu type clothing. It's about 50% of all of the clothes in terms of the textiles, and it actually is derived from what? From oil. So understanding where your clothes are at, especially for females and males, because why? Because depending on the textile fabric, and there's numerous studies that have been done. This study was specific about the sperm quality, so the actual ability for the sperm to swim, and different textiles were used in terms of putting different textiles on, I believe it was dogs, and then tracking their sperm. And in this small study, so it was only 24 dogs, it found that polyester was the worst. And so this is where understanding what clothing that you are utilizing to decrease toxicity is highly important. And again, this is a slow process. For me, it's taken me years at this point to slowly transition from the fast fashion world by understanding what my clothes are made out of. But most importantly, where I want us to start would be our underwear and our sheets. And so if you see anything that's marketed, as my opinion, like, well, this shirt or these pants save plastic water bottles, like, that's going to be one of the worst things, because what they do, right, is they take the plastic and they reuse the plastic so that they can make your clothing, which again is a whole process, which we don't want to get into. You can do, again, research on yourself. But the whole point is that it steals electrons from your cells in the most sensitive areas. So for men, like, your underwear can't have any polyester at all. Like, that is the worst. Women, like, you have to be aware of your bras, of the type of underwear. And like, if we're especially at home, which I think oftentimes now people can at least work at home some of the days, like, I highly recommend being hyper aware of the type of clothing that we're utilizing in the most sensitive areas. So again, sheets, like, making sure your sheets are organic cotton would be a high priority for me, because that's somewhere where you're spending 8 hours every day. Okay. Next is water. So here are the common contaminants that are found in tap water. Chicago has some of the worst tap water that's ever been recorded, in at least for the past 20 years since the EWG has been recording water. So what's interesting to note about this process is that what is oftentimes considered legal is not considered safe. So one of the best things you can do for yourself for fertility to decrease toxins, so that your endocrine system, your system that controls your hormones, has an improved capacity to function, is being aware of the water in your home, the water you drink, and the water that you shower in. Okay. For individuals that don't own their place, this can be a $80 fix per month. If you get a good shower filter and you get spring water delivered to your apartment, you can get a good filter for your home, even if you have a large home, for $5,000 to $6,000. If you can't afford that, you get at least one for your sink at about $2,000. So this is a doable solution if it's a priority. And I think especially for women, it's one of the most important factors because of PFAs and PFOAs and lead and arsenic in tap water. Because just want to make sure we're not missing anything here. Because these are forever chemicals that can never be excreted by your body, right? So we want to make sure that, especially early on in our body's ability to handle toxins, we aren't being completely inundated with toxins that we can never excrete, which then build up over time and don't allow our endocrine system to function appropriately. And this is one of the most important concepts, is the thyroid, ovary, adrenal triangle. So what most, especially women, but for men, you just throw in testes here, it's the endocrine triangle. These are all of the glands that control your hormones and that, most importantly, control your metabolic capacity, how your body utilizes energy, right? Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to decrease toxins, especially by easy toxins that aren't super crazy. You're spending like thousands and thousands, right? Is that we decrease the toxicity of our overall environment so that all of our endocrine glands have the metabolic capacity to do their job. And that's the easiest to explain way to understand why we want to reduce these toxins at such a degree, right? And so most of the time what's happening is that people's thyroid or their ovaries or their adrenal glands, usually all three, are being suppressed is because the overload of toxins that someone's experienced through the fluoride in your water, through the stress at work, through an emotional toxin, through your potential trauma that you've experienced as a child, right? Like whatever it is, both mental, emotional, spiritually, and physically, our toxic overload or our toxic load is so high that our endocrine glands can't do their job of really controlling our metabolic capacity within our physiology, which does not allow for our body to want to get pregnant because it can't even control its metabolic capacity for yourself, right? And so it's really important to understand this triangle, again, the thyroid, adrenal, and ovary or testes triangle, and making sure that we're doing things consistently to support those glands and to support those hormones so that we can be in a place where those glands controlling our metabolic capacity are in the best place possible, right? And so it first starts with decreasing these toxins. So if you aren't in our Telegram group, it's a place where we are usually posting things, and for me, it's just I find stuff and I throw it in there. But this is also something to really keep in mind, which I think it was 2 months ago. I did a full presentation on the GI tracts, specifically talking about the food industry as a whole. And so this was just some new information that I came across while spending time researching for this, is that close to 100%, like 90% of non-organic citrus fruits that were tested by the EWG have these two fungicides on them, which are directly associated and known carcinogens, and they are also known endocrine disruptors. What does an endocrine disruptor means? It means that these toxins have been shown in both animal and human studies that they directly impact this whole process that allows for, again, the thyroid, adrenal, and ovary or testes triangle to work properly. So I probably recommend, if you are thinking about pregnancy, if you want to get pregnant, if it's even on your radar, we do everything we possibly can to avoid these types of very powerful endocrine disruptors. So what do you do instead is that you get to know your local farmer. You buy produce in season. You make sure that the produce you're buying isn't from South America in January, right? Like simple things that we've done for thousands of years is eating in season and learning how to can food so that they can last a long period of time, or learning how to use foods that are in season. And so I want to just make sure that we understand through the food supply is one of the most intoxicating ways that we see endocrine disruptors or problems through our endocrine system, which effectively control our hormones. So another one of the most common things that we always see is EMFs. I'm sure you guys have probably heard this term before. I didn't put the full term, but it's electromagnetic frequencies. So most people get this confused. Let me use this slide instead. Is that this is a wide range of basically wavelengths that we can't see, right? There's different types of them. Some are really high frequency, some are low frequency. And the overarching concept is that we all know we aren't going to stand in front of an X-ray machine because there's damages. So when you go to the dentist, they use a lead plate of some sort to block that wavelength. Well, also there's what's called non-ionizing frequencies that come from the earth, but also come from technology and where we're at on the globe. And these can be they can disrupt our endocrine system to a high degree, because what's happening is that they're directly impacting the cellular metabolism. So how your cells actually produce food and produce energy, I should say, and then use food to produce energy and then excrete toxic waste, which is what happens every second of every day in your cellular capacity. And then you excrete those toxins. So these different types of frequencies, they directly impact your body's ability to have that energetic transfer from food to metabolism. Okay. And so here are, again, just like I know individuals, like we rely on technology. I'm giving this presentation through technology. So it's like anything, is that dose is important, distance is important, like how close things are to you. So this is why it's really important, like, to not have your phone in your pocket. It's one of the worst things you could do, one of the most sensitive areas possible. I see like women on the treadmill with their phone in their bra. Like that is scary to me. Or having Bluetooth headphones, like the same concepts, right? Is that you're blasting one of the most sensitive areas, your brain, to a frequency so that Bluetooth can connect. So at least sensitive areas, at least what you can control, putting your phone on airplane mode at night, turning off your Wi-Fi, doing at least the basics is important to allow for your cells to not be detoxed even during the night, which the whole concept of you going to sleep and getting rest is to detoxify. So if we aren't giving ourselves the proper chance to do that, good luck. Here are some other things that I constantly am playing around with. There's this really cool new technology called Quantum Upgrade. It's like relatively cheap. I want to say it's $30 a month. And they have my phone and other addresses of mine where they're constantly supporting my body with different types of positive EMFs. And then you can also do sacred geometry, which is using shapes and different things to allow for your home to be as restful and peaceful as possible. Okay. So here's the other slide I was going to talk about, Lauren, for your initial question, right? Is that what do we do about this other stuff? What do we do about vaccines, about plastics, about synthetic birth control, about ultrasound? We already talked about food toxins last time, pharmaceutical interventions, dental fillings, the air quality, like chemtrails, the air quality in your home. There's cosmetic toxins, and the list goes on and on and on. And so sometimes we have to be aware of the toxins we're being exposed to, right? This is an important conversation, which is why I'm talking about it. But if we're exposed to a toxin, we may not have control of that experience, or we may have not been as educated as we would have liked to been by the experience. What I recommend to do is excrete the main organs of, support the main organs of excretion. So what does this mean? It means that the main organs that excrete your toxins are all right here. And so if we aren't supporting these to return to health, meaning that if your body is communicating a toxic load, which part of that communication may be the inability to to conceive, right? It may be infertility. Then what we have to do is support these areas of discharge. So like, how is your digestive tract? How is your urination? Are you sweating every day? Are you allowing your muscles to contract so that your lymph can pump back to your liver? Are your lungs able to effectively push out CO2? And are you supporting the female reproductive process so that your body can effectively excrete toxins through your menses, which is what it's supposed to do? Okay. And of course, for us, it's always mental, emotional to some capacity, right? Because we're more than just a machine. We're a spiritual, energetic, frequent person, which is what makes you, you. So if you aren't supporting that as well, then it's going to be a challenge. So what we do with many of our patients about like a specific toxin that we might see, or this is all like depending on their story, right? Because when you're trying to help someone solve their problem specifically, you have them tell you their story. And if you ask the right questions, the person explains, well, I was fine, or things were going okay until this happened, or I started to do this, or things changed here, or whatever it is. And their ability to communicate their own story allows us as individuals to uncover what potentially the problem was in what priority. And so I just think that's important to keep in mind, because like these are all going to potentially need a little bit of a different twist depending on where we're trying to go. But that's why I want to talk about the 4 toxins that I did, because I think everyone can change that tonight. So tonight, if your Wi-Fi is not turned off, I don't know what to tell you. So I want to pause here for a second. Any questions so far? You can either post in the chat. Sure didn't miss any. So I want to just talk about this. I know we've been on detox here. Is that detox is the most important for before pregnancy. And as I have already mentioned, which I'm going to talk about Weston Price next, Weston Price found that traditional tribes were taking 3 to 4 years to prepare for pregnancy for each person, right? So a mom or a dad, a male, a female who were trying to conceive, was a 3 to 4 year process. He found that he started in the mouth and found that without cavities, that these children, they weren't brushing their teeth, right? They had no cavities and there was no chronic illness in the entire tribe. And so I want to just keep this in mind, is that when we start to get pregnant, and we actually, if we do get pregnant, is that the conversation shifts from, have we decreased the toxic load so that load does not go to the fetus, to nutrition. And part of this process is that experience of that when a female gets, when the conception process happens and there's a fetus, is the toxins, if the mom is liberating toxins through her tissues or cells, it's going directly to the fetus. So this is why we want to be ultra careful, like ultra careful with all of the toxins that I just mentioned to you previously about when we are pregnant, but also that we aren't liberating these toxins through chelation or supplements or fill in the blank, because we want to support the nutrition of the child as much as we possibly can without increasing the child's toxic load. And you can do a quick search online again, but it's something like the average child that's born in America now is born with over 100 toxins within their bloodstream. I believe it was like something like 82 or 84. So we want to decrease the toxic load before we get pregnant. And then during pregnancy, we want to basically up our nutrition as high as we possibly can, so that the child has all of the building blocks that he or she needs to thrive and to have a successful pregnancy. And when we do this, is what's amazing is that the pregnancy process is extremely smooth, as smooth as it can be. And the postpartum process is relatively easier. And then the health of the child is exponentially improved. And so these are, again, traditional natural laws that we're just following. So Weston Price is my hero in all transparency, because he was a dentist in the 1910 to 1920s, and he was in Ohio realizing that all of his children, all of his childhood patients, their teeth were completely rotting out. So him and his wife traveled to 14 different places across the globe. Imagine this, the 1920s and 1930s. They recorded all of the food, the nutrition density in the food, and they took pictures across the globe of what he called a primitive person that was basically still living off the land in the traditional way. And then he went to the first generation of individuals, so the same ethnic population on that continent, and went to the first urban area where they were eating processed foods, sugar, oils, everything else we'll talk about. And so he took pictures, and this study will never be able to be completed again, right? Because we don't have this population to compare. And so if we think about what was happening at this time, like just look at the jaw structure, look at the teeth, right? A lot of even the ailments that children have today directly comes from the nutrition of the mom and dad in pregnancy and the nutrition of the child, especially in the first 5 years of development. So super important. If you guys haven't researched him, I mean, it works amazing. He's still got a really popular organization now. But the pictures are just amazing. We talk about like having a strong jawline. We talk about being a beautiful baby. That comes from symmetry, and symmetry comes from nutrients. So if you want your child to be healthy, most importantly, right, spiritually, mentally, emotional, right, it starts with you. And it starts with making sure that we have the proper nutrients to compare. And so this is what he compared, which again, these like stats are just like, this was in 1938. Think about this, almost 100 years now, like 80 years. It's just nuts to think about. And think about what's only happened to our soils getting depleted from here on out. Like it's not even just mind-boggling. Number one, it makes me hopeful of how resilient the body actually is, but also it should put some perspective about what we have to do at an exponential degree to eat certain foods that we don't eat in our culture anymore to give our bodies these relatively, hopefully somewhat comparable percentages to what these individuals intuitively ate for thousands of years. And then man thought that we were smarter to make convenience over health, right? And so you can read this again. There's this amazing book. It's like literally amazing. But I'm going to keep this simple, and we're on time. Wow, we're on time. This is amazing. So I want to just put this on your radar because most people aren't eating the majority of these foods, maybe a few of them, but there's many foods in here that you see in almost every category, because across every tribe, there were specific foods that people, and these tribes, I should say, were eating in every part of the world. That's mind-boggling, okay? Raw dairy was part of that equation, whether it be whole milk, yogurt, cheese, butter was part of the equation, okay? Organ meats was part of the equation across every single culture, specifically liver. So I know there's a lot of like social media hoopla about Liver King and all this complete nonsense in my opinion, but what this is it's utilizing in terms of nature's natural laws about what has the most nutrients for what specific vitamin and minerals. You see here that most people aren't eating any of these things. If not, they're eating maybe just eggs, right? And so going out of our way to incorporate nutrient dense foods is the most important thing to do when you're thinking about pregnancy and you are pregnant, which means either through supplement form, which I don't think it's effective and not as effective as incorporating different foods into our way of life that we haven't tried before. We didn't grow up eating. Like my grandma's favorite food until the day she died was liver and onions. She grew up on a farm in middle of nowhere, Nebraska, and they were poor, and that's all they could eat. And until literally the week that she passed away, that's all she ate. And I just think it's really important if you would ask people of demanding where you're from in terms of the world. We see some of these foods like, how can we eat that? Nobody eats that. Like, the importance of this is it's so important for our population, so we can get back to the nutrition that we're supposed to have. And the majority of the high quality of these fat soluble vitamins and other minerals are in these foods. And so, again, we already went over this into a high degree, so I'm not going to spend too much time here. But if you want the best book on this, it's written by Sally Fallon, and it is Nourishing Traditions. Okay, she has a few different books, but it's like a cookbook slash educational book that explains how to get these foods into your day-to-day. It's not something that happens overnight. So I want to just put that out on your perspective as well, is that it takes time to incorporate these different foods, but over time you feel better. So like, well, why would I ever go back? Okay. So this is what we have to prioritize once we get pregnant as a female, or once that process really starts to take place, so that we can get the proper nutrients. So people ask me about prenatals all the time. And, I think like everything, it probably has its time or place, but like some people are coming in with, like, I believe this one was, I think I just searched like what's the most common one. I think it's called like 1, I believe, actually. And the issue that I have with a lot of prenatals is there's synthetic vitamins and synthetic minerals that are grown in some lab at some capacity, and they're usually a byproduct of the fertilizer or the petroleum industry, because what they do to make synthetic vitamins and synthetic minerals is that they have a carbon chain, and then they, not all the time, but the majority of time, then they put on different elements to make whatever mineral or vitamin they're trying to make. So you're starting with literally petroleum oftentimes, and then you're adding on and you're changing the carbon chain to make the synthetic vitamin or mineral. And so I find that even ones that say they're whole food have a lot of additives or a lot of soy or things that I don't necessarily recommend. So if I were to recommend a supplement with something, it would be eating as healthy as you can and incorporating these 4 things into your day-to-day. Fat soluble vitamins, B vitamins, minerals, and minerals. So that's why I would do all of this. I think it's a good place to start. It's more expensive, right? You aren't just buying this, but like, look what's in here. This is complete trash. Like, if you're, it's nuts. Like, company's probably making like $60 million off this complete fabrication there. Like, look what's in here. Like, it's nuts. Like, it's just absolutely mind-boggling. So whatever you do, don't use this. It's not healthy. It's not good. At least start with this. Most importantly, start with this, right? Like, start with what you're eating. It's something you can control every day and get to know where you're sourcing your food. You do that, your mineral status, your fat soluble status exponentially increases. Okay. So I'm just going to quickly run through this case and be on time here, which is phenomenal. So I've had a few different cases the past 6 months, at least, if not 3 months. But this was one about, I don't know, 8 months ago, maybe 9 months ago. And she was like a relatively healthy individual, and she had some GI problems, but her main goal was like, I want to get pregnant. And that was her main goal. It was within the year. When people say, by the way, like they're relatively healthy, it just always makes me smile. That can mean different things to different people, but like sleep was average, stress from work was okay, like nothing crazy to think about. But she's been to like almost every alternative practitioner that she could have ever seen, like acupuncturist, chiropractor, osteopath, a shaman. She was going to see a fertility expert. I don't even know what that meant in terms of like an energetic fertility expert. She was like, she put all the folks that she saw in her intake form. And I was like, whoa, I guess it's nuts. She was eating okay. I mean, I think relatively good. She just stopped taking synthetic birth control maybe 6 months before. And so to me, what this screams is that there's no proper framework for her to orient herself with what the next steps would be. Because when we're thinking about healing, is that if we're doing all of these things without a proper framework in mind and without knowing what action steps should get us what result, and if those action steps don't work, what other variables do we try to address, then we end up spending a lot more money than we have to, and we end up spending a lot more time and energy doing things that don't fit into a framework. And that's exactly what our first conversation was about. I was like, I personally think that unless you're getting results, which it's been, I think this point was like 9 or 10 months of her trying. I was like, then why are you doing this stuff? She's like, well, it's going to work at some point. I'm like, well, if you have a good connection with the practitioner, like that's a different story. Like maybe you're acupuncturist and you think it's going to be well long-term, but ultimately, if you're trying things for, a year or 2 years and not seeing results to some degree, like she still had, I think at this point, her digestive complaints were worse than when she started. And I'm like, well, then we need to give it some other out. Maybe energetically you aren't connected with that practitioner, like whatever it is. So that was our first conversation. This is what we did. Like we did the basics with her. Like it wasn't anything crazy. She had a dairy, fruit, and sugar intolerance. She would switched out all of her water. We made sure like her sleeping situation was ideal. Like her room was completely dark. Her room was at 65, I believe, 64. This should say not bruising, dry skin brushing. So that's where we started. Like we did this for maybe 4 weeks, I believe, to make sure that her digestive tract improved so that she could ultimately absorb all of the food that we were going to pump her full of so that her nutrient status could be exponentially higher. And once we did this, then we also had her like really prioritize her mental and emotional component of her relationship, because I do believe that there was some resentment between her and her partner as well. So we helped her uncover that false belief pattern, which once we did that, there was like a really big shift in terms of their relationship, which after that then created an opportunity that she stopped doing all of her intense exercise classes and she only started to do yoga, walking, and lift weights. And then her sleep drastically improved. And so here, I don't have the timeline on here, but the timeline was 3 months or 3 to 4 weeks, her digestive tract improved. I would say in 8 weeks, she was completely locked in with what she was eating. And then she was really trying to prioritize her relationship, her mental, emotional capacity. And then in 3 months, she had a kid, or she got pregnant. She had a full-term pregnancy. So this actually must have been about a year ago. And her child's now, her infant's like maybe 3 months old now. Home birth, healthy pregnancy. Everything's up to this point has been successful. I'm helping her through the next steps, right? Which is a successful pregnancy is only the first step. And then the conversation is like, what do you do next, right? How can we prioritize the next 3 or 4 years of the child's health, specifically with nutrition, detoxification, so that your child can be their healthiest self, right? And so here are some really good resources for you that if you don't have, I would definitely put it on your radar to start. This is a book that it's the same title of the book. This is a really good book for everything from pregnancy to vaccine discussion to nutrition to breastfeeding. Really good book. Another okay book, I would definitely recommend this one first. This was written by one of our mentors, Tom Cowan. It's really interesting about vaccines and the childhood schedule. And I mean, I have hundreds of others that I can recommend depending on where you're trying to go or what issues you're having. But I'm going to pause here and take about 10 minutes or so and answer any questions or take any concerns, and we can talk about your specific questions or anything like that. So we got a few questions here. Water filter brand you recommend for the home shower? Yes, yes. So let's start, Tanner. Do you recommend testing hormones? Yes. When trying to conceive, if so, which hormones would you recommend testing for both women and men? Any test kits / brands you recommend? I really actually like the Everlywell hormone tests. Well, the issue with you when we get into hormones, in my opinion, is that especially for the female 28-day cycle, it can get challenging depending on where you're at because the ranges change. So what I would recommend to do first is I would recommend trying to use the fertility awareness so that you can get in sync with your cycle first. So I would do the foundational principles first, because if you aren't aware of where you're potentially at within your cycle, then what can potentially happen is that you can get wrong, or the test will be taken at the wrong time, or they won't be accurate in terms of the specific ranges that you can do. For men, yes, testosterone would be important for men, but if you're really having trouble with fertility, the first thing I would do for a man would be to get my sperm concentration and sperm count tested, which is a pretty inexpensive test. And then if that came back fine, which again, what's fine? I mean, to me, that's like, doesn't mean a lot, right? Then I would check testosterone for sure, thyroid for sure. So I believe on that Everlywell for the female, it also includes, I believe, don't quote me on this, but I think it includes a basic thyroid panel. Again, like that would be a huge priority. I don't know if I would do a spit 24-hour cortisol test, but I would like really be aware of my energetic and my just like response as a whole in terms of like how my stress response was. And if that wasn't appropriate, you can always test for that. But most people are aware of that as it is. When do you stop detox practices between ovulation and menses trying to conceive? Yeah, I mean, that's a good time frame. I also think to keep in mind that like some of the stuff you don't have to be perfect at, right? Like doing the best you can and being aware is important to not like detoxify while we are, trying to conceive. But also like if it ends up happening and things happen, like the body's resilient, right? This is a long-term play. So I think it's just important to have a good perspective about that and keep that into consideration. A water filter brand you recommend for the home / shower? It all depends on price point. So for the best brand that I recommend that I think we have a 10% off code to would be the Greenfield Solutions. Again, it's gonna be the most expensive, but in terms of the quality, it's really good. If you don't own your place, like I don't own my place, so I have a Symbiotica shower filter, which I'm recognizing that it doesn't last as long as I would like it to last. And then I get Mountain Valley water delivered once a month. There's a cheaper options. Like there's a good brand. It's called Alta that is just under your sink. You can do something like that. It's like $500. You change the filters once a year. You don't have to screw around with like delivery or anything. And you can just get a shower filter. So that's an option as well. What brands would you recommend for the supplements you shared on the previous slide? Yep, that's really important. We have, I believe, a fertility link on our full scripts, but like specifically with cod liver oil, like that would be something that I would highly prioritize, that the quality is good. Because the quality is, for something like that, if you don't get, like some people walk into our practice and they're seeing other alternative practitioners and they're taking fish oil. And I'm like, what are you doing? Like you're basically taking rancid oils that are creating your body to be more inflamed. So like, it's really important to know this stuff, but especially with things that can potentially change constitution, like a fat, right? I would personally be hyper aware of that. I'm trying to think of the one on top of my head that I personally use. Give me 1 second. I can tell you. Rosita is the name. I believe it's how you say it. Sorry. Obviously, I'm a little fatigued today. But that is the one I would recommend. Liver supplements for something like that. A few different options, but like just getting a grass fed, making sure that again, the quality of the animal is important. And that's going to be really important for iron and for B vitamins as well. Tanner's got one more question about any sperm. I don't think that is a big factor in terms of like any like sperm test kits, in my opinion. You can usually, if you do have insurance, depending on your insurance, you can usually get that from your practitioner or from your primary care, excuse me. I have had patients use a wide variety of the specific test kits, and I haven't seen a big change, right? Because they're basically all standardized tests. So they're taking the sperm and they're looking at the concentration of the sperm, and they're looking at the motility or the quality of the sperm. And so that's going to be standardized across the board. So I don't think it matters. I would do whatever you find. Someone I know changing from folic acid to folate, his partner conceived. Him and his partner conceived. Yeah, that's we see that all the time, right? And it's a few different reasons why, in my opinion, but ultimately, like your body only takes folic acid, and I believe it's something like 15%, maybe 10 to 20%. I'm not sure the exact percentage of the amount the body actually converts to the active vitamin. And so that's where I think it's so important to know, like, people are like, well, I'm taking something that has folic acid. I'm like, well, who cares? Like, who cares if your body can't convert that properly? So there's a lot of nuances, which is why we didn't necessarily go into all of that today. But I want to just keep in mind is that if you're eating proper foods, then you don't need to necessarily worry about like what vitamin or what mineral you're taking, because your body is going to have everything that it needs from nature. So, another awesome question. So Jess is taken off. She's going to be sending this out via email tomorrow, so you guys can get the replay of this. Dan's asking about the effect of sauna, hot tub, semen retention have on fertility. Good question. I don't think the results here are necessarily out yet, which I have thought about quite often. So I'm sure as you guys have heard that like sauna, specifically cold plunges, like, in a huge way are like trending at the highest capacity right now. And there's a traditional Taoist practice that's called semen retention, which is basically using specific tantric sex practices, I would say. There's probably a maybe more proper words to describe it, but it's basically just utilizing breath work through even intercourse, but also then just throughout your day-to-day to retain your semen until you want to conceive, ultimately, is how I would describe that. I would say there are negative effects that nobody has talked about within the space. So what I wouldn't be that concerned with is that unless I was trying to conceive like that, probably 48 hours to 72 hours, I wouldn't be that concerned with that. But during the actual time that my spouse or wife or partner, whoever was we were trying to conceive, I would avoid those type of aggressive practices. And the rationale is that there's a reason why the male scrotum, right, isn't in the body. And that is because it wants to keep the temperature of the sperm at a lower degree than the temperature of the body, right? And this is also traditionally why we wore certain clothes, because certain clothes allow the moisture to be absorbed easier and for airflow to happen to a higher capacity. So this is one of my biggest issues with polyester clothing, is that it doesn't allow the, I'm going to call it the breathing process of the skin to take place naturally, increasing the temperature of the body. And so this is why, especially for men, that polyester underwear, Lulu shorts, like this stuff is horrible. And so, but in terms of going back to your question, those type of extremes I know do impact the sperm quality. I don't think it has like a long-term effect, in my opinion, because the life cycle of sperm isn't that long, and because your sperm can turn over to such a high degree. Semen retention, I would say probably the same thing. I don't necessarily know a lot of research that's been studied on that, but I do know that, like, historically, that was what we were utilizing for many practices. If you look at everything from like war to tantric sex practices, all of these things were for specifically men, they were utilizing semen retention throughout the historical time. So I can't believe, at least in my opinion, that's having any short or long-term effects. So 1 or 2 more questions. I'm more to take some time to fire away here. If not, then just so you guys know, I believe it'll be maybe August, if not September. I just want to throw us out there is that my business partner, Dr. Alex, he has been studying a specific protocol for cancer and helping many people in our practice overcome cancer in a holistic way. It's the Gonzalez protocol is what it's called. And he's been the main educator. He's educated some of the most prominent alternative cancer practitioners in the country now. And so he's going to be doing the next talk or the next webinar on that topic specifically. So I think it's good for everybody, but I also think it's a good opportunity for anybody that you know that's struggled or is struggling with that, who potentially wants a different perspective, to potentially be on the call and figure out, kind of like we talked about today in this conversation, like, are there other ways to approach common diseases or symptoms that the body's communicating in a holistic way? And so that will be, again, I believe August. Don't quote me on that, but we're going to sign off here. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I hope you gained something. These resources here are really awesome. So, like, for sure, don't hesitate to purchase these, or even go to like the Western Price and search whatever topic you want. Yeah, you guys are all, we love having this conversation. I know my energy has been a little bit low here tonight. So would love to keep the conversations. If you guys have any more questions, don't hesitate to contact us. We'd love to support you guys and make sure that you have all the education that you need to not only be healthy with yourself, but also potentially raise the awareness for our future generations, so that we can prioritize their health as well. So you'll get this recording tomorrow, and we'll chat with you guys soon. Have a good night.